episode 8 of my series Public Art and the Economics of Imagination, where I investigate the radical potential of public art by questioning the economic structures that operate behind the scenes, made with the support of King's College London, Future Narratives Lab and Art School Plus, as well as Professor Schanbaum of Coventry University. My name is Toby Tobias Kidd. I am myself an artist and a musician, and this episode I speak with Emily Rosamond. Emily is an academic, artist and writer. Along with a wide array of related work, she has co-written a paper that I am particularly interested in discussing, called Volatility in Finance, Art and Culture, for the Finance and Society Journal, in which she serves as an associate editor. She teaches at Goldsmiths on subjects spanning performance art, art theory and digital publics, and has research specializations in social media, speculative logics of networked personhood, and financialization. She is also an advisory board member of Distinction Journal of Social Theory. To expand on my introduction, I'd love it if you could give us a little bit more of an overview of your research in a very broad sense.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here. So my work is highly transdisciplinary. I teach in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths, and I teach performance within art history and contemporary art theory. I also teach a little bit on the financialization of culture, and I work, of course, with finance and society as part of that. And my work draws a little bit from cultural studies and literary theory as well. I've been very interested in the past several years in kind of three terms, which kind of come up over and over again for me, which are reputation, character, and personality. And I'm very interested in what these concepts do within complex signaling environments. So on social media, how these concepts and terms might be shifting. And also, I'm interested in what financial conditions do to these terms. So some of my recent work has been looking at YouTube's use of and perhaps shifting of personality and how it works. For example, the way that it mandates influencers and content creators to mobilize an idea of their personality that's very specific, that's very niche. You know, I'm the lock-picking lawyer. I'm the guy who talks about trains in London and all the tube stations and their histories, et cetera, et cetera. I'm the makeup tutorial person. All of these really well-defined kind of market niches that are about projecting a very specific idea of what personality is and how it can operate on a platform. What that says about the way that YouTube pays content creators, what that says about the way that people have to mobilize a particular understanding of personality in order to garner some attention within this attention economy. So these are, and one thing that I'm very interested in is that reputation, character, and personality, these are different terms that in a variety of ways speak to what we think of as valuable about people, about humans. Maybe even on some level, they are recalcitrantly humanist concepts. They speak to, they are often thought of as concepts, although I don't think this is necessarily the case, but they're often thought of as concepts that are specific to humans and to the values that orient a human-focused economy and set of cultural productions. And I'm very interested in what happens to these kind of maybe even residual humanisms within what I sometimes refer to as post-human signaling environments. So when these concepts become entangled with infrastructures in all kinds of unusual ways. So when I hit like on Facebook or something, and I am therefore maybe putting my little vote in on someone else's reputation and how important I think what they have said is, and therefore how interesting or compelling I find them. It's very interesting to me to think about that as something that goes through a bunch of fiber optic cables, roadside cabinets, content delivery networks, servers, as well as all the corporate sort of architecture that is Facebook itself, and having a CEO and COO and all of that. And to think about the way that reputation becomes infrastructural in new ways, which in my view kind of extend the way that financial markets also change the way that people understand reputation. So if I think of like a stock market share going up and down, for example, that might be infrastructuring the way that a company has a reputation in a quite a significant way, so that as an investor, I can think about how other people view the future prospects of a particular corporation. And I am, as Elena Esposito put it, observing the observers of the value of that company. And I am trying to make a strategic investment based on those observations.
I love that phrase, observing the observers. So, as well as working in the academic framework, you're an artist, you make art.
Really, my training and my start as an academic comes out of being trained as an artist. And so to me, I think practice is absolutely crucial to how I think. I'm able to bring together dialogues from very different fields. And I do think that's quite interesting, even though it's often very difficult. So in many ways, part of the effect of being trained as a practitioner is that I became a very transdisciplinary scholar. So it's really shaped my scholarly research in that sense. And I would say there's always a bit of a push and pull for me between making and writing. I often pick up slightly different and yet complementary questions and concerns within my practice that I do within my research. So sometimes it feels to me like flip sides of the same coin. Like the coin, as it were, is a set of interests that I have, a kind of what I'm oriented toward. And then on one side is my written research, and there are a whole set of interests that sort of seem to me to work better within the medium of writing. And then there are others that are, that seem to work better in practice, but they're almost the adverse of one another. And a lot of my current practice I've been placing under the rubric of somatic infrastructures. In other words, I have been thinking a lot about signaling systems that are not immediately available to the senses, but nevertheless profoundly structure how we can communicate with one another. And then raising questions through my practice around what it might mean to actually try to set up a thought experiment whereby it becomes possible to sense, these infrastructures in some way. For example, I did a show at the 68 Art Institute in Copenhagen a few years back called Semiotechnical Traffics, which is a very small quote from Paul Preciado's book Testo Junkie. He talks about semiotechnical traffics in relation to hormones. In other words, he talks about the fact that the invention of the concept of the hormone, the discovery, the hormones are discovered, but on the other hand, the concept is kind of invented as well. This posits the body as a thick interiority of signaling systems, such that we come to think of the insides of us as being, profoundly about different hormones, which are signaling chemicals creating, ferrying communicative traffic inside of us all the time. And he points out that this is very interconnected with the fact that we live in a telecommunications age in which signaling systems on a massive scale are also happening, and that there's a way in which the body and its environments are both coming to be conceived as part of
Mm.
semiotechnical traffics. Within that, I was looking at like a kind of early invention which became part of Wi-Fi signaling technology eventually. And this is Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil's World War II patent, which was about a hidden signaling system where you could have signal hopping. So basically, they were solving the technical problem that the Allied forces fighting the Germans in World War II, Hedy Lamarr was Jewish and had to flee Europe to come to the States. Hedy Lamarr, the famous Hollywood actress, who was also kind of a genius inventor, she had to flee Europe and come to the States in World War II. And so she was really invested in helping with the war effort. And she was interested in the technical problem that, Americans and Allied forces had radio controlled missiles that were, attacking German U-boats, but the Germans could then easily figure out which frequency the radio controlled messages were coming in on, and then they could jam the signal. So what she and George Antheil, the experimental composer, invented is a signal hopping system. So basically, you would have a player piano roll type of thing, so like a page with dots that moved. And you would have one of these in the boat and another one in the missile. And then
Mm.
to do the radio operation, they would hop frequencies according to the player piano roll.
That's very clever, yeah.
Yeah, and at the time, nobody was interested in this invention at all. It wasn't used. But much later, a similar kind of thing is used in things like Wi-Fi systems, where obviously not exactly the same. There's not a role per se, but it's the same idea of kind of hopping frequencies is used all the time. And so I was very interested. I'm very interested in the hidden aspects of communication that cannot be sensed
Mm.
at all, but that profoundly shape the way that communication systems can appear, and then also how we think of ourselves as kind of hidden communication systems that we ourselves cannot sense or directly comprehend. And so I was experimenting, among other things, with player piano rolls, as well as a
Oh,
book work that was sort of telling stories about hidden communication systems, including Hedy Lamarr's invention, as well as plant hormone communications and things like that. And yeah, and more recently, I've been studying choreography at Trinity Laban as
oh.
a way of kind of thinking of my performance practice from a different perspective. And I have done a participatory choreographic work, which I see is very much in progress, called the carrier wave, which is about the fact that in radio transmission, you have to have, in order to be able to transmit a radio signal, you have to have something that is called a carrier wave, which is basically just a blank signal at the given frequency that has to be laid down, as it were. And then that frequency is modulated slightly differently if it's AM radio or FM radio, but it's modulated, and then that's how you get the signal. But it's sort of the idea that you have to have a blank signal before there can be any content that is transmitted. And again, I'm very interested in that blankness. And so I did a participatory piece where I invited people from the audience to come and throw and catch beach balls while lying on their backs. And then the soundtrack was a kind of instruction piece that everyone could listen to, including the audience. And it became a kind of experiment in thinking about carrier waves and then transmitting signals.
I think it's actually interesting how, some of this research is really about people branding themselves into very niche personalities or propositions. And yet you're approaching that from a wide transdisciplinary practice, incorporating sort of multiple ways in.
Funnily enough, I hadn't fully thought through that connection, but you're absolutely right. I think what I'm interested in a way, is on some level, there's the surface of cultural production in a digital age, which looks like maybe a whole bunch of YouTubers trying to make it and having a niche and, being incredibly attention mongering. Also, we could think about the politics of that. I mean, YouTube is filled with sort of alt-right influencers who are getting
Mm.
covert funding from people who are trying to train young folks to have alt-right views so that they will vote accordingly in upcoming elections and all of that. It's a very fraught political terrain as well, this world of kind of amped up, assetized personalities. You can be anything you want on YouTube in theory. You can be super niche, you can take a totally unique approach to the content that you want to deliver on your channel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, that sort of tends to produce this sort of self-similarity at the same time. So you have all these super niche personalities, and then also the idea of the fungibility of personality as such, that one really niche channel is kind of about lockpicking lawyers isn't really that different from a niche like yoga channel or a niche like unboxing channel or whatever. And it just kind of goes on and on ad infinitum. But I guess I'm trying to say, well, what if we try to really inhabit the infrastructure and really think about what it means to be mediated and to be imbricated within complex signaling systems that are reordering how we address others. I'm a huge fan of the literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. He has a concept called addressivity, which I think about all the time. For him, addressivity is something that is often missed when we think about linguistics or communication, because it's not a property of any given part of a communication, of a word, for example. It's an aspect of the whole, which is the quality of something being addressed to someone. And so
Mm.
he defines a genre, for example, the novel, as having a particular conception of the addressee. I suppose in many ways, one way to put what links practice and theory for me is infrastructure. Another one would be addressivity, how we see ourselves as facing others, as communicating with others, as turned toward others. That's really kind of at the heart of it for me.
It's making me think again about YouTube, these social technological spaces, and how we inhabit them, much like a town square, but in a very different way, because these are controlled in ways that are very hidden. And that's bringing in questions about being in the public, what being in this mediated public means, I guess, how we face each other. So I think it would be really nice now to talk a little more about these aspects while sort of thinking about this word addressivity.
I'm currently revising a book draft. I feel like I've been revising it forever. It's a truly Sisyphusian task, which is currently titled Reputation Warfare. And it is my attempt to account for what happens to reputation on social media platforms, at least so far. And one of the things that I think about in that book is I call it a privatized public sphere. In other words, social media, there are a lot of debates out there as to whether or not social media counts as a public sphere, and if so, in what sense. It's certainly not a public sphere in the sense that the philosopher Jürgen Habermas might have thought of what a public sphere is. In other words, a place of sort of rational debate. I mean, I don't think in this day and age we could possibly think of social media as a particularly rational space. But it nevertheless, undoubtedly, fulfills some functions of publicness. Obviously, that is, there are all kinds of debates on social media which have to do with people talking about their stakes in local community issues, having discussions about politics, all of these things which are absolutely part of the idea of a public sphere. There are lots of theorists that have tried to consider this and come up with Zeynep Tufekci, for example, talks about a networked public sphere. I use the term privatized public sphere to think about, and which is in a way, kind of very straightforward, but it's about this sort of the sense of the privatization of the public sphere. And I think in the age of kind of super rich tech bro CEOs buying themselves social media platforms, perhaps at a loss, in order to garner political influence. I think it's incredibly palpable all the time that our spaces for public debate and discussion are very much in a few hands. I mean, on some level, not maybe for the first time, insofar as media has, such as newspapers, have been controlled by, a few moguls for in past moments and have had an outsized influence on public debate. But of course, the extreme reactivity of social media, the extreme participatoriness of social media kind of ramps up those dynamics and makes the spaces in which we're all talking to each other the spaces of CEO accumulation and all of that. So the idea of addressivity is absolutely linked to all of this. Of course, how we might address a public, a fundamental question. I mean, I talk a lot with my students about performance and protest. So, what does it mean in this day and age when we might not even believe that going out into the streets and holding a placard or indeed sharing an activist post on social media maybe does a whole lot to change things, but nevertheless, millions and millions of people around the world still believe this is a crucial thing to try to do. How is one addressing a public and which public when one, goes out onto the street and holds a placard or shares something activist on social media? I mean, that's an absolutely crucial question. And it seems to me that the question of facing in such moments, who are we facing when we march down the street with a sign? Obviously, politicians, but equally, clearly some kind of conception of a public, such as it is. So the link between these things is absolutely crucial. And one thing that I have previously argued, I wrote an essay a while back on addressivity in online dating platforms. And I was thinking about OkCupid, not so much from the perspective of the actual experience of using such a platform and dating online, although, I touched on that in a sort of general way a little bit, insofar as like there's a prompt, the platform prompts you to kind of treat yourself like a portfolio of interests. I like dogs and I like walks on the beach and wine and whatever. But and I have all these great attributes, and here are some of them. So there's an enticement to package oneself as a set of attributes, attractive attributes. But what I was really interested in is that, of course, OkCupid at this time was largely based on revenue from advertisements. So for most people, it was a free service to use. And then it was, kind of advertisement driven, although you could pay to have the free version. So, what I was interested in is the fact that the addressivity of the situation is not fully accounted for somehow from the user's perspective. So, the user might be thinking, who am I addressing? Obviously, prospective dates that I might like to attract. But in the background, I'm also addressing an algorithm that is, maybe auctioning my attention or feeding into an advertisement, an advertising surveillance kind of scenario. But I don't necessarily have any language for that. We have such a long history of, matchmaking and dating practices to kind of think about our behavior and actions in relation to, but not so much the surveillance scenario. So I was interested in the fact that the one of the co-founders and CEOs of OkCupid, Christian Rudder, writes books about how great it is to have big data insights to look at online dating. And so he talks about his, insights by analyzing all the data from OkCupid users. And then he's constantly sort of suggesting that as daters, we should all be really excited about having the insights of big data to help ourselves, get a better match because big data will make a better match for us, and that we can be part of the data set and therefore counted in some way. And so I argue that figures such as Rudder are actually doing some of that work. They are trying to make us more consciously interested in the fact that we are being surveilled. I think the question of the relationship between addressivity and the public sphere is really interesting, and it's changing a lot as we speak.
It's really interesting, that whole concept of being counted, like, oh, your life means something now. You are part of the counted, part of the data set. But in a sort of different way to a democratic understanding of being counted might be. And it's also interesting to hear how some people have a real belief in the positive aspects of this kind of data participation.
Yeah. Well, certainly someone like, Christian Rudder of OkCupid is very interested in embracing, the insights of data. And yes, as you say, being counted. I mean, there's a lot in my seemingly never-ending book draft edits about this relationship between voting and liking.
Mm.
That liking is a kind of ersatz vote that's of course not a vote in a kind of liberal democratic sense in any way, but nonetheless the idea of being part of the vote is absolutely crucial to reputation on social media. And so there's a whole chapter of the book that's looking at the question of what constitutes a we in credit rating. And I call it the crowdsourced credibility regime, i.e., there's an idea of, like, for instance, credit scoring, gives us, like, some company, Experian, for example, will, look at our financial repayment history and give us a credit score or something. But social media is operating kind of like that, but in a crowdsourced way, i.e., credibility comes from everybody liking your thing, or and so there's a sense of like a participatory credit scoring kind like mechanism that has shifted from the financial world of credit and its allocation into the social.
I like that it also feels like it relates to the real niching of the personality and what feeds the algorithm or gets the attention. So what you are also doing is voting on what parts of someone's personality they should keep.
There's an immense sense of real-time feedback and its incorporation into the development of cultural production that, of course, is tantamount to social media. I mean, this is profoundly shaping cultural production today. So obviously, YouTubers are constantly invited to respond to which content does better, which content garners the most engagement, and they're getting loads of metrics in real time. And they're under a lot of, if they want to monetize, they're under a great deal of pressure to get those metrics because there are minimum metrics they have to achieve and maintain in order to be able to qualify for the YouTube Partner Program, for example, which pays some YouTubers a portion of the proceeds from their channel. I have a colleague, Joyce Goggin, who is writing about Taylor Swift these days, who she came out of social media as well. And so it was also, some of the biggest stars and celebrities today have come directly out of social media, and this sense of cultivating a fan base through feedback, through comments, through directly responding to one's audience.
I was thinking of one thing before about these social media spaces and the concept of the public sphere. And I think there is something about them that is like a simulation of a public sphere. Thinking about, like you were saying, the Habermasian back and forth is lost to sort of heightened antagonism and algorithm. And also how, as we all know, these social media spaces are also spaces for broadcasting. So that's a strange mixture, I think.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? And of course, I mean, it's there are many, many debates around Habermas and many people who argue he's wrong about all sorts of things. So, I mean, Nancy Fraser famously said, well, Habermas's idea of the public sphere is absolutely rooted in like white bourgeois men. And she really argues that one needs to kind of rethink it. There's a lot of people who play around with different versions of like terms like counterpublics have been very crucial to some of these debates. And, Andre Brock Jr., for example, on Black Twitter, largely on Black Twitter, talks about satellite counterpublics, Black Twitter as a kind of satellite counterpublic that is offering spaces for very counter-hegemonic public discourse. There's the question of whether an idea of rational debate really can orient an idea of publicness, full stop. And nevertheless, I mean, what's happening to public debate and public discussion in this world is, I mean, I think the way that it is taken over by algorithm is profoundly politically, shaping and maybe we could say pre-ordering. It is in the process of creating a new order on some level. I am very, very interested in Louise Amour's essay called Machine Learning Political Orders. And she kind of argues that there's a kind of the idea of machine learning is coming to directly influence politics via figures like Dominic Cummings, who was advisor to Boris Johnson in the COVID years, for example. And she argues that there's this idea of like some of the ideas in machine learning, like back propagation, become political protocols, i.e., as she puts it, the solution gets the problem it deserves. We're in a moment when, for instance, like AI is starting to produce personalities. So I've been talking with my students lately about a Spanish modeling firm that used to work with influencers for modeling campaigns. And then they decided that they really hate working with influencers because they demand so much money and they show up late and they're entitled. So they decided to go into the AI modeling business instead. And so they produce AI models and make 10,000 euros a month from their AI models who do AI campaigns and do AI Instagram feeds of their AI holidays. And so there's a sense of machine learning and AI kind of taking over the discourse itself on some level. AI is now kind of also doing personality and just kind of taking over the task. So, needless to say, this is an incredibly volatile public sphere. And this is why I think it's so interesting to look at concepts like character, reputation, and personality, because they are maybe in the process of not being quite so human anymore.
I would really like now to focus a little on that article you wrote, Volatility in Finance, Art and Culture, which I believe you wrote with Benjamin Lee. I think this is really relevant to our listeners following on this investigation, and will really help get a sense of the sort of economic structures, some of them that are so involved in the world we're in. So maybe you could start by unpacking this word volatility, in fact, and then connect that to the markets, and we can go from there.
We were thinking about the intersections of financialization with cultural production. The concept of volatility is pretty frequently used colloquially, and it just refers to changeability, often for the worse, volatile weather, volatile personalities, volatile conditions. Usually these aren't things that fill people with delight to hear. Within finance, the discovery and pricing of volatility is central to the expansion of what is often called financialization. And financialization is a term that is contested. There are some thinkers that really don't like this term at all, in fact. But nevertheless, I think it's at the very least provisionally useful. And it describes, we could think about it in a kind of periodizing way to describe a period of time, maybe roughly from 1973 to 2008, if I had to put dates on it. But this is a period when financial markets really expanded their reach. And the trades in financial derivatives were hugely important to the global economy. Now, so basically, and I'm aware with terms like this, I always have to step back, step backwards. So basically, what is finance is the first question that we have to kind of think about, and how does that relate to the economy? Often what you will hear is a distinction being made between the so-called real economy, i.e., producing stuff in the world, maybe goods and services that can be bought and sold. Production and productivity, right? Finance, on the other hand, to put it in a blunt and simple way, we might think of as making money from money. So, in other words, it could be investing in the stock market, investing in financial derivatives projects. For example, if I wanted to, in maybe in the mid 2000s, if I were a wily investor, I might be investing in mortgage-backed securities. So special products that would allow me to have a tiny little stake in hundreds of thousands of people's mortgage debts, and I could then invest on that. Now, of course, finance has existed in many ways like forever, as long as there's been an economy. I mean, the long history of derivatives comes out of agriculture because people were trying to hedge against the risks of a bad crop, by coming up with ways to, kind of hedge their bets in case things went wrong. So finance has been with us for way, way longer than 1973, of course. But the reason that I draw attention to this date is because this is the date when the Chicago Board Options Exchange took off, and financial derivatives trading was massively amped up in part because of the Black-Scholes model. So basically, this is a mathematical equation that allows you to price financial derivatives, so options in this case. Basically, these are financial products that allow you to buy the ability to buy or sell a particular asset at a specified price at a specific date in the future. So that way I can hedge my bet. So if I buy an option on, another investment, I will, if the market is not in my favor at that time, I could exercise my option and get a better deal. So it's a way of kind of hedging my bets based on market volatility, the changeability of the market. There came into being in the early 70s a new way to price volatility, to kind of decide, okay, if I'm going to buy an option, what price should it be? That has something to do with the level of volatility that is in the project that I'm buying the option on. In a way, financial markets become, well, first of all, they ramp up and become massive in proportion. And second of all, the pricing of volatility as such becomes crucial to what is sometimes referred to as financialized capitalism. And so this is one of the ways in which volatility is profoundly a shaping force in the society that we live in. In other words, for investors, you might think from the perspective of someone, let's say, trying to buy a house or trying to buy, well, pretty much anything, even some stuff from the shops. I mean, maybe we don't really like volatility that much. We'd rather have stable conditions. We'd rather just have, things that are at a set price and we can kind of depend on them and our salaries, kind of stay sort of in the same vein and the prices are predictable and we can buy stuff, at a predictable price. And for an average buyer of things, we could say maybe we don't like volatility that much. For an investor, volatility can be a really good thing. Even if it means markets are tanking, you can still come up with a way to bet on that. For example, there's a wonderful but very troubling book called Alt Finance, which argues that it was basically they argue that it was the sort of second wave financial institutions, those that were not yet established by the Thatcher era, but that came after, like hedge fund managers and stuff. Those were profoundly pro-Brexit because they can easily transform the tanking of the British economy that Brexit was undoubtedly going to do. They could transform that into a great investment opportunity. Certain investors really love financial volatility, even if it's not the market, overall doing well, because they can invest in that. And that means that we have to think about who has a stake in whose volatility as a fundamental political question.
I think this is very, very interesting, and it's just something that's not discussed enough insofar as how much it affects everything we do. It's so important to understand this. I wonder if you could talk now more to the production of the arts and public art in relation to this, which I think is really what you were writing about anyway.
Benjamin Lee and I were questioning, what do we make of volatility today, when the volatility that we have isn't necessarily 100% wedded to financial derivatives? I mean, obviously, financial derivatives still exist and lots of people use them. But at the same time, there are so many other sources of contemporary volatility in all different senses. So if we think about the climate crisis, this is going to surely increase the volatility of weather conditions, of people's life stakes, of crops, of all kinds of things that are genuinely terrifying in the coming decades. Equally, we have immense political volatility at the moment. The idea that the conditions, the sort of financial world is incredibly volatile right now, but maybe for different reasons than 2008. So, for example, the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, weighed in on the closure of the Silicon Valley Bank back in 2023. And he was addressing the question, which a lot of people were asking. So basically in 2023, this large American bank called the Silicon Valley Bank, which catered to the tech entrepreneurs and things like that, it folded. And a lot of people went, wow, are we back to 2008? Is this going to be another 2008 style financial crisis? And Varoufakis's answer was no. And the reason is the conditions are completely different. So in 2008, derivatives trading was out of control. There was a lack of regulatory oversight, or at least effective regulatory oversight, such that a lot of the derivative products, like collateralized debt obligations so you could have like mortgage-backed securities, so investing in hundreds of thousands of different mortgages, a tiny, tiny little bit. these were basically vastly overvalued, and the risk of these of people defaulting on their mortgage was vastly underreported, and so the whole valuation of everything kind of collapsed. That's not at all the case with the 2023 Silicon Valley Bank closure. Instead, Varoufakis argues, it is more that there's a systemic failure of the entire financial system. I mean, to put it pretty bluntly, in that central banks have just one tool really that they can use to address a try to right the economy, and that's setting the interest rate. But one interest rate cannot possibly balance all the things that you need to balance to have a good economy. So curbing inflation, encouraging growth, encouraging stability. Like you cannot have all of these things with just one interest rate anymore. It is actually impossible. And so the economy is totally messed up and unworkable at this point, on to put it in really simple, blunt terms. What does that mean for cultural production? I think that the world of cultural production is incredibly volatile for all kinds of reasons. And I see this all around me in so many ways, talking to and knowing so many artists. For example, I see the art market picking up artists, specific artists, for, let's say, maybe a decade or so. They get lots of galleries behind them, lots of institutional interest in their work, and then they're just kind of dropped. I've seen many, many artists go through that kind of cycle. I'm also very curious, and I'd have to say, kind of troubled by the sort of Instagram generation of artists and what they're having to go through. Obviously, young artists coming up are incredibly interested in Instagram for good reason, because it's an extremely powerful tool for getting your work out there. And a lot of artists have done really well. With a good Instagram, they can really help their careers, and that's great. Anything that helps artists, I think, is great. However, the consequences of this overall, despite, the fact that it might help artist X or Y, at any given time, I think are quite difficult and quite troubling, right? Again, this is a world of great volatility. And in this case, it's volatility of attention as much as anything. Artists are under extreme pressure to do well in the so-called attention economy of social media, have a really good Insta presence and all of this. But algorithms are fickle. And what happens when your work is tossed out the next day or the next year or the next decade, or, even if it's great that specific artists do really well out of their Instagram, what are the overall implications of this? And then what are the implications of social media's particular version of volatility, which is, volatility exacerbated by algorithms? For instance, YouTube kind of drives attention inequality in many ways. So it will try to figure out which YouTube content is really going to garner a lot of attention, and then it will boost that. So that then you have, on the one hand, YouTube is a place where supposedly anything goes and everyone can have a channel. But on the other hand, there's this drastic inequality of attention that it is driving. And it's also very fickle. So you could easily get, turfed just as you're picked up. These are obviously not conditions that are conducive to the flourishing of artists overall in the long term. Even if artists, understandably, are really interested in trying to surf the volatility waves of social media, because, well, in many ways, you kind of have to these days. But equally, I'm very interested in trying to think about what it means to support people's practices after the crash, when the waves of volatility do not happen to be in their favor. What then does it actually mean to have some kind of peer-to-peer support network? And it's precisely these kinds of initiatives that I think are all the more important in an incredibly volatile art market that will just, sort of pick people up, swallow them whole, and spit them out.
That's a brilliant example of the real life impact of the volatility you were talking about and how it impacts everyday people and everyday art making. I think that I am really interested in, at this point, this area of publics and social media that you have been talking about. And I'd love to delve further into this, connecting it to this idea of collective agency and the public space. And I believe you've written about the concepts of speculative communities and the entrepreneurial imaginary. And I think this might be a good time to bring these in to help us sort of bring it all together.
I'm very interested in this problem of what happens to a we in social media, which, as I'm kind of arguing in my book, extends and evolves financial market protocols. So it basically takes the kind of financial market imperative to drive volatility and sort of applies that to the social, full stop, as well as changing the exact sort of mechanisms around, kind of how this operates. But certainly I would say social media inaugurates what I call reputation volatility. In other words, the volatility of our reputations becomes a crucial factor in our ability to live our lives, maybe be artists, and have some kind of an audience or a following, and many, many other things about our life prospects. Social media is kind of constantly amalgamating individual clicks or likes into some kind of semblance of an us. But is it really an us? The media theorist Wendy Chun has a really interesting article called Networks Now, Belated Too Early. And she argues that the network is almost just an assumed structure within neoliberal thought. Everyone talks about networks. It's a network becomes just like an assumption rather than a question. Why is something a network? What's the difference between a network and a community, for example? And she argues that networks and the idea of a social network as well, so having nodes within a network, and of course, social media makes it imminently possible to visualize oneself as a node within a network of different friends and different friend groups and communities. She argues that networks preclude collectivity. By mapping us as nodes constantly, we're kind of not able to envision collective action because networks give us a kind of replacement for what collectivity really looks like. In my work, I'm trying to flesh out the problem, at least, by looking carefully at how ideas like reputation and personality do some of that work of rerouting collectivity into rather individualistic frames of reference, even though the individual isn't really what's at stake in social media anyway, because individuals are constantly sort of broken up and recombined, in machine learning algorithms and outputs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this is a really, really crucial question. You mentioned the phrases speculative communities and entrepreneurial imaginary, and I'll start with the latter. So entrepreneurial imaginary is a term that I have used in some of my past work to describe a kind of entrepreneurial disposition, which orients an imaginary. In other words, a sort of place of, we could almost call it a place of ideology in a way of how we're supposed to live our lives, such that, for instance, every aspect of life comes to be seen as a kind of entrepreneurial pursuit. So I can try through, say, YouTube, for example, I can try to, make something of my leisure time by putting some of my hobby videos out there and just seeing what happens, or or I can see myself as a kind of investor in my future life as an online dater or something like this. And it's interesting. I slightly question the relevance of this term today a little bit. I haven't used it so recently. And the reason for that is because I've become very interested in economist Brett Christopher's work on rentier capitalism. He argues that rentierism, that the world that we live in is fundamentally about garnering rents on assets that you control. Whether that's, and I think we can think about this on many scales. So it could be the company Arqiva that owns a whole bunch of telecommunications infrastructure, and other companies have to rent access to their infrastructure. So that's one sense of rent. Or another one might be I've, cornered my market niche on YouTube as a content creator. And so I can then generate rent on my own personality because I get some revenue from my channel. And he argues that rent is predominantly about having rather than doing. In other words, it is a proprietorial rather than entrepreneurial ethos that is involved in rentierism. And so actually I have certainly looked at entrepreneurialism in my previous work, but I wonder if it has given way to a proprietary disposition more than an entrepreneurial disposition that is central to contemporary subjectivity. And also, just to say, this focus on entrepreneurial subjectivity kind of has been a prominent theme for a lot of theorists, kind of coming out of Michel Foucault's reading of Gary Becker's idea of human capital in his account of the neoliberal subject in his Birth of Biopolitics lectures from 1979. Speculative communities is actually a term which I have referenced a little bit in my own writings, but it's actually a term by my colleague, Eris Comparosos Athanasiou, who teaches at UCL in sociology. He has a book called Speculative Communities, which is very interesting. And he's trying to update Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined communities for a financialized age and argue that we have something like speculative communities. So it's a very interesting read. And for me, one of the most interesting aspects of it is his constant attention to the struggles over who has access to the tools of speculation. In other words, there have been many moments in financial history where only those with privileged access to, for example, the trading room floor, are able to access the tools of speculation to be able to try to surf the waves of volatility, shall we say, to be able to make good on the volatility of financial markets for themselves. Whereas others, average everyday folks, have been often excluded from the ability to speculate. And he argues that there have been many, many struggles over access to the tools of speculation in financial history, and that this struggle is a crucial component when we think about the politics of speculative communities today. Is a really interesting lesson of his book, I think. I have been working on a concept that I've called cohortification, which is in some way slightly related to what Eris is arguing in speculative communities, but in other ways a little bit different. I argue that, and this is part of my essay on YouTube personalities as infrastructure, where I'm arguing that YouTube personalities are, in a way, a kind of platform infrastructure in that they're critical to the operation of YouTube. And I argue that there's a tension in social media between communities and cohorts. So, community, the idea, at least, of a community is something like a social formation that might maybe interact with other members of said community. There may be even potentially some kind of an idea of collective identity or collective action associated with a community. And then there's the idea of cohort. So, for example, you can have a cohort study in science where you look at, so the cohort might be a specific group of people who might share a characteristic or two in common. So they might be, I don't know, age group 40 to 45, and they all have one health condition the same. And so the study is about what sort of insights can be gleaned from studying the cohort overall. But the idea of them is that they share something in common, a trait in common, but they're not necessarily linked socially. And in fact, in a cohort study, they're not linked. I argue that on social media, the tension between these two things is really important. Social media is constantly cohortifying us, i.e., placing us into cohorts of people who may not be connected with one another, but we are all advertised the same stuff, where our attention is being auctioned off to the highest bidder in real time. So I'm arguing that one of these sort of infrastructural functions that YouTube personalities play is that they navigate this tension between communities and cohorts. So social media platform algorithms and advertising auctions that cohortify us constantly, that kind of are implicitly placing us in groups. Oh, this is one of the users that we can advertise Cadbury's chocolates to, or whatever, they are not, those algorithms are not able to give us any sense of a community around our own cohortification, our own placement into constant cohorts of separate yet similar users. But YouTubers are doing that. They are kind of creating cohorts in a way, like you could say the fan base of a particular YouTuber all share something in common. Maybe so if it's a YouTube channel specializing in London train stations, these are all people who are really interested in London train stations. So they're a cohort, but the YouTuber and the YouTuber's exciting personality and kind of niche personality that appeals to a specific subset of people transforms the cohort into a community who might chat on the channel. They might interact with one another in the comments section. And so they can have some sense of a community that transcends the logic of cohortification, which is what platforms are doing. So I'm very interested in these questions of community at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like a central sort of theme for me. This sort of how do we think about communities and build communities that have sort of meaningful interactions with themselves and in the world. I think what I would like to talk about now is bringing all this together and thinking about where things are in a practical way. As a person in the world, seeing art, making art, I wonder if you have any thoughts of the sort of imaginary potential or actions that might be moving towards, what you might like to see more of.
Really interesting question and difficult because I'm not that optimistic that the institutions that we have to help with the production and dissemination of culture are all that good for us. And I think artists have it bad in one way, but equally, if you think about like the punishing terms of Spotify returns for musicians, it's a pretty terrible world to be a cultural producer in many ways, even if, of course, within all of these systems, there are a few people who do really well out of them. In many ways, I think of this moment as a moment in which there is a sense in which the institutions that are meant to support the production and dissemination of art and culture are volatile. In some ways, we're seeing a kind of deinstitutionalization of culture where there's a crisis of faith in some of the legacy institutions meant to support the production and dissemination of culture. And on the other hand, we have a reinstitutionalization whereby new platforms are kind of saying, well, hey, we'll step up to the plate and we'll help you disseminate yourself and your work. But equally, that's an incredibly volatile proposition with troubling political consequences and troubling consequences for artists as well, I would say. What I think is really necessary, as I've said before, although I wish I could say this would straightforwardly solve everything, I would really like to see more discussion, more blatant discussion about the negative impacts of the volatility of this whole situation for cultural practitioners, a kind of deinstitutionalization and reinstitutionalization, a kind of empty shellism, a hollowing out of legacy institutions, and an emergence of platforms that have their own toxicities. Really, in many ways, an attempt to valorize small scale community productions like small crit groups and other local initiatives that really are very clear about saying we don't value art the same way that these platforms do or that these legacy institutions do. We want to make a space where there's another way to value it. Again, all of this depends on volunteer labor and having the time to set up small scale initiatives. But in many ways, my faith is on small scale cultural production that tries to find at least some ways, some forms of dissemination that are a little bit against the grain of what we're being offered right now. And also a little bit of a study of art history. We're seeing arguably a decline of interest in fields like art history. And I think this is a moment when studying the past is pretty important.
And equally, that's why it's so important to have this conversation today on this investigation, because these sort of wider financial implications help us understand so much more about the conversations we're having around arts and culture. Would you like to share a bit more about where people can find out about your work?
All of my publications are on my Goldsmith staff page. You can find links to everything there, even stuff that's behind a paywall. There will always be a preprint version. And then I don't have a publication date for the book Reputation Warfare, but that is on the far horizon to look out for.
Thanks so much to Emily Rosamond for her enlightening conversation, helping us to get a deeper understanding of these complex infrastructures so often hidden from view, bringing to light some of the volatile financialization that shapes the world we live, work, and make art in. Let's think about how we can create these other spaces to support art and dissemination that moves in some way against the grain. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to get updates on when new ones are released, which I will try to keep as regular as I can. We do have some very exciting guests coming up, and I hope to see you next time on Public Art and the Economics of Imagination.